October 1879. The dusty edge of the American frontier near the Arkansas River. 7 men rode out from a cotton plantation to recover what they called lost property. Only 2 returned. The number is small on a ledger, but enormous in consequence. The account books at the county clerk's office recorded a single line that would not make sense until years later, when other pages were unearthed and stitched together with witness recollections and pension affidavits. The land smelled of hot dust and spent gunpowder. Late sun turned hems of shirts the color of old parchment. The distant river clattered like a chain of coins. Among the fields and the wooden quarters, a man named Isaiah moved like a shadow, silent in a way that made overseers uneasy, and made neighbors invent reasons to avoid his notice. He was described in a probate inventory as lean, with bruised knuckles and hands calloused by iron and rope. To the owners, he was property and labor and an item in ledgers. To those who knew his small acts of careful kindness at night, he was a figure who read maps of the stars as if they were work orders. What transforms this into a story that unsettles more than it fascinates is what the records, when read together, suggest. A former slave who learned steelcraft and tracking and then turned those skills into a methodical and terrifying campaign of frontier retribution that left men missing and men afraid. We will open judicial reports, private letters, overseer diaries, and pension depositions. We will read a map of trap lines drawn faintly on a plantation account book and listen to descendants recollecting a silence that spoke. A single clerk in a courthouse wrote toward midnight, "I could not sleep after I read the affidavits." That sentence, in a cramped hand, is a small rebellion against the neat ledger lines that tried to make everything tidy. To understand the arc, first we have to see the ground that shaped Isaiah the man and the frontier he turned into his instrumentation. The county that framed this event was a patchwork of small plantations, cotton gins, and new towns that had sprung up along the river for shipping. The economy pivoted on cotton and on credit. Banks and merchants kept ledgers that extended value across seasons and people. The sound of mule hooves and the creak of post and beam structures under the weight of late summer heat were constant. The region had been a border space for decades, meaning its law enforcement was a patchwork of county sheriffs, private patrols hired by wealthy neighbors, and ad hoc posses. The social hierarchy was strict. Owners and managers kept inventories of human bodies in the same files as stock and plows. Illness, punishment, and sale were regular notations. That system created pressures large and small. Debts passed from man to man. A failed crop could mean the sale of a family. An unpaid account could mean a shrunken household. There were creaking economies of shame and enforcement. Oral testimony gathered decades later would emphasize 2 recurring facts. First, that surveillance was constant. Neighbors kept tally of comings and goings and reported oddities. Second, that forms of informal justice operated by consensus. If a worker fled or a mule went missing, a group might convene and retrieve what was deemed lost. That combination of formal ledger keeping and informal recovery practices produced the conditions where a man could be both invisible and acutely observed, where skill could be mistaken for complicity or forafted in the worst possible way. The plantation itself was a long house of weathered clapboard with whitewash peeling like old bandages. Its gin stood at the back like a breathing machine, clanking under steam and cotton dust. The quarters clustered in rows of simple cabins, their roofs patched with whatever scrap the world provided. The master's office contained a mahogany desk, tin inkwell, and a ledger book stamped with the plantation name and the careful columns of work, food advances, punishments, and sales. Neighbors remembered the smell of lye soap rising from wash days and the metallic tang of the blacksmith's fire, where Isaiah sometimes worked. Among the people who inhabited the place, there were names that recur. Eli Whitaker, the plantation owner whose handwriting dominated the ledgers. Thomas Grady, the overseer who kept a small stick for corporal punishments. Mary Lawson, the cook who hid biscuits for babies. Father Ambrose, a traveling preacher who kept sermons and an eye on the children. Sheriff Caleb Morgan, the county's law. Silas Reed, a merchant who kept accounts in town. Ruth Dean, a laundress who would later give testimony. Jonathan Pike, a riverboat hand who noted what he saw along the bank. Those 8 characters move through the narrative and act in ways that define, shape, and consequence. The cabin where Isaiah slept had a rough wooden bed and a forge-made kettle. Morning sounds included the rubbing of hands to wake them and the soft pop of coals. In his first mentions, Isaiah was quiet, efficient, and observant. A young man who arrived in the county as a child after emancipation, he took to metalwork and to the rhythms of tracking deer and mending harnesses. A backstory emerges in fragments, but enough to understand his formation. Isaiah's backstory is central and must be told in detail. Born into bondage in Mississippi, he grew up beneath the rafters of a slave quarter where the smell of damp earth and the cries of infants were as much part of the architecture as the posts themselves. He learned to read the weather by the way smoke hung over the swamp, to repair an axle with a piece of wire and patient force, and to trade small favors for a spare piece of cloth. When the war came, he was moved south and then back again with owners and camps folded into the chaos. His memory, how to hold a file steady while the metal glowed, how to size a trap so it would not wound but incapacitate, how to stitch a boot seam so it would outlast a season. After emancipation, he remained on the land in conditions that were technically free but practically similar to bondage. Credit kept families close, and names were listed in ledgers as debt. Isaiah worked at the forges of 2 plantations, learning how to temper iron and fashion devices that could be sold or used. He developed a reputation for making small knives and fixing the gears of plantation machinery. He was also attentive to patterns of movement and to the small rituals of those around him. He did not speak often. People mistook silence for acquiescence. But his silence was a tool as much as it was a habit. He listened to talk by the river to gauge the movement of crews. He watched the way riders mounted to catch a scent on the wind. Those private observations fed into a patient training of body and mind that would later produce a man who could read tracks like shorthand and work iron into cunning shapes. When a child in his quarters was taken to market for debt, he kept a private list of names and dates in the margins of a discarded ledger page. Those marginalia would later serve as a map for grievances, as proof that were missing when reconciliations were demanded. Opposite Isaiah were men who embodied the local power structure and whose own backstories show a trajectory that ends in lethal confrontation. Eli Whitaker, the primary owner, descended from a line of planters who measured themselves by acreage and credit. He had studied law briefly as a young man and maintained a careful voice in letters and a demand for order in his household. To him, property meant capital and control. Thomas Grady, the overseer, had served as a paramilitary man during the war and kept habits of surveillance and discipline. Sheriff Caleb Morgan was a product of frontier politics who had built a career on being decisive, sometimes too decisive. Silas Reed, the merchant, kept a ledger that connected Whitaker's farm to markets upriver. Jonathan Pike, the river hand, kept the schedules of boats and fragments of gossip. Mary Lawson and Ruth Dean were caretakers of the home's interior world, but also custodians of memory. Their combined biographies make clear what the social and economic stakes were: land, credit, reputation, and the preservation of a social order that measured value in columns. Those men and women made decisions that compressed possibilities for those like Isaiah who labored in their sight. The records show patterns of punishment and the occasional sale that might be interpreted as corrective. The backstory of the opposition is not monochrome villainy, but a network of actors who shared a script. Their training in law and force created a predictable cadence to their response to loss. They believed in retrieval, in posse justice, and in public example. They wrote letters about debts, exchanged receipts, and noted when a hand went missing from the toolhouse. The collision between their expectations and Isaiah's patient accumulation of skill was a collision between two systems of order. Isaiah's transformation into a feared man of the frontier began with preparation that was quiet in the manner of a craftsman. He collected scrap iron, tempered wire, and made snares with a fineness that suggested a mind trained by necessity. He used the smithy not only to repair, but to invent. He fabricated traps that could disable the horses of riders without leaving obvious human marks. He studied the river's eddies and the ways fog settled in the low fields. He practiced leaving false tracks, muddling prints at the margin of a field so a tracker would follow a trail he had prepared. In the evenings he read, when he could, stolen portions of a hunting manual left behind by a traveling hunter, tracing the line drawings with a soot-stained finger. He fashioned simple masks from leather and stitched parts of old boots to make gaiters that changed the sound of his steps. He learned to crouch and wait and to be patient until wind and light made a perfect moment. He also kept a private ledger of grievances that listed names of men who had sold kin, who had demanded fines, who had hung a brand of shame on his family. That page was written in charcoal and tucked in a hollow of a floorboard. He was known to others as laconic, as someone who worked at his bench and did not ask for more. But the same hands that fixed an axle were the hands that could fashion a deliberate snare, and his silence had become a kind of strategy. The inciting incident was both small and explosive in consequence. A rumor that a young man named Samuel Dean had assisted in removing a set of tools from the blacksmith shop set in motion a posse. Thomas Grady called for men to ride out and recover the property, and to teach what he called a lesson. The night before the retrieval, a terse letter arrived at Whitaker's desk requesting restitution. The letter was unsigned, but ink bore the imprint of a tempered hand. The next morning, a party of 7 set out, led by Grady, with maps and a pistol each. They tracked through barbed brush and across a creek that smelled of hydrocarbon and rot. Witness accounts later were inconsistent, but the ledger entries and a riverboat log recorded departures and failed return times. The timeline shows that the party split at dusk. 2 men found a trap where a horse's leg was broken. A cry rose and then was cut short. A skiff in the shallow part of the river listed, and a body was found. Face down. The survivor returned with a story of an ambush. The plantation diary records a series of terse entries: men missing, search party, panic, fear. An overseer's note says, "Found gear shredded like a net. It was not an accident." The margin of one abandoned notebook contained a rough sketch of a pattern of snares matched to names. Testimony years later remembered the sound of hooves cutting the quiet and of a man's cough in the dark. The episode escalated into a pattern. Instead of a single recovery, the community discovered that bodies would not simply be found and that the landscape had become a place of suspicion. The scene where men realized they were being hunted is rendered in small, detailed acts. The smell of gun oil and fear thickened. Shoes made thin, scuffing noises on the barn floorboards. A dog refused to enter the underbrush. Those spending days after the incident described a metallic tang in the air, as if iron itself had changed. Reports filed by Sheriff Morgan in town speak of ambushes and of careful traps set to disable without leaving a trail of obvious gore. There are multiple descriptions in separate documents that together reveal a grim pattern. The deaths that followed were not random. One man was found with his throat bound and a crude metal clamp nearby. Another collapsed with his reins cut and a bit of rope looped in a way that showed calculation. A post-mortem note penned by a doctor in the county, who likely never intended his marginalia for public reading, included terms like constriction, probable asphyxia and evidence of premeditated restraint. This is where a forensic description is necessary. The county medical note described patterns of injury that suggested strangulation devices that used cordage and a metal mechanism to hold tension. The wounds were not frenetic but systematic, suggesting a designer who understood pressure points and the limits of tearing. The doctor noted that ligature marks were consistent across victims and that the devices were likely custom-made from tempered iron and non-elastic cordage. That level of technical detail points away from spontaneous violence and toward a craftsman's plan. It is worth 300 characters to precise the method. The instruments combined a spring-tempered loop and a slotted cam crafted to tighten under weight while avoiding visible tearing of fabric. The evidence led officers to concede this was not simply frontier banditry. The core sequences of pursuit and reaction became chess-like maneuvers between Isaiah and those who pursued him. The pursuers tried columns and night watches and mounted patrols. Isaiah countered by shifting patterns, sabotaging saddle gear, and moving through low fog where no horse could keep footing. In a scene of tension, a posse of 8 confronted what they thought was an enemy camp by the river. Dialogue in that scene, recorded later in different narratives, offers a window into both the moral fog and the human cost. They argued on the bank about whether to burn a camp. One voice said, "I say we burn it and be done." Another responded, "If we do, they will take the children." A third pleaded, "We need the truth, not vengeance." The leader said, "We were sent to recover property, not to perform justice." The next exchange snapped short. Someone shouted, "There is a sound by the reeds." Another answer came, "Quiet, listen." The leader said, "Load." Then there was a shot, and a silhouette fell. Voices moved between accusation and fear. No one recorded calm thought. The survivors scavenged small pieces of metal that were later cataloged by the sheriff as anomalies. These exchanges show a group that oscillated between law and mob. In other scenes, dialogues ran longer and more revealing. A captured man, bound but alive, spoke in fragments. "Who taught you to set them?" He said, "I was handed a tool and I learned." The captors debated whether to hang or to take him to town. "I will tell you what I did," said Isaiah in sparse words. He described traps set not to kill but to frighten. He spoke about ledgers that numbered debts and about the times his family had been called to the block. When asked, "Why did you make them?" he said, "Because someone had to stop the taking." The exchanges numbered 9 in that scene, and each line highlighted a collision of perspectives. The textual ledger of his confession was recorded in a sheriff's book, but the entry was later altered, and the extra lines went missing for decades. Those missing lines matter because they changed the legal framing from murder to accidental death in the court of public memory. Institutional responses accelerated as bodies accumulated and as merchants and owners demanded action. The county held a meeting where men wore heavy coats despite the warmth, as if the weight of choice required covering. They decided on a militia-style response and offered bounties. Notices were posted in town and letters were sent to neighboring counties. We will turn to those official papers because they reveal both a plan and a fear of escalation. A formal posse was organized under Sheriff Morgan and included several men who were not from the county but were hired as trackers. They used scouting techniques drawn from military recognition manuals, deployed pickets at river crossings, and attempted to create a cordon around likely refuge points. Documents from the militia reveal an approach that mixed brute force and pastoral rhetoric. They also reveal errors that would become decisive. The cordon failed because it underestimated the landscape. The malicious maps show an inability to account for small ravines and beaver ponds that Isaiah used to mask his movements. There were also intelligence failures. Informants who were promised money or leniency often turned unreliable. The institutional machinery tried to apply law rapidly, but without the kind of careful local knowledge Isaiah had spent years acquiring. That mismatch created opportunities for counterattack and for consolidation of fear. A journal entry by a militia captain noted, "We are hunting a ghost." Public communications tried to suppress panic, but they also rationalized the killings as unfortunate necessities in keeping order. The response left legal ambiguity that would later be used to scrub the official record. After the immediate episodes, a different life began for Isaiah in public records. His name appears in a soldier's muster some years later and in veterans' affidavits that read like fragments of a life reconstituted. He served briefly with a volunteer unit that patrolled the frontier, and those military documents record a transformation from outlaw to enlisted man. The service records show dates and places and a description of wounds and duties, and they include a cipher that suggests that authorities sought to neutralize a figure by folding him into formal service. The enlistment papers describe Isaiah as having a scar across his jaw and a flat nose from a blow. In comrades' recollections, he was taciturn but dependable, good with a horse and with campfire maintenance. There are testimonies from a Corporal James Hurst, from a Sergeant Abel Norton, and from a captain who wrote in a later pension deposition that Isaiah saved a man's life during a crossing by improvising a sling. Those records complicate the portrait. They rewrite an outlaw as a man who wore a uniform for a stretch and earned a modest pension claim later. The transition to formal service changed public perception in some quarters. Newspaper mentions became less frequent and legal actions faded. Yet private letters and ledgers show that many in the county never forgave what they deemed murder disguised as justice. Isaiah's presence in records mellowed into ambivalence. He was both a veteran and a cautionary tale. His later movement into itinerant metalwork and boat repairs matched a man who had re-entered civil life without apology. Simultaneously, there are private notes written by Whitaker and others that arrange his life in ways meant to reduce scandal. Land transfers were made quietly and papers tucked into court drawers. What followed in the community was a slow reshaping. The plantation's economics were altered after the killings, and the costs of patrols and replacements and legal uncertainty led to land being subdivided and sold. Families that had been boycotted by rumor moved away, and some names disappeared in estate papers. Memory worked along two registers. In some households, Isaiah became a villain in the oral tales told to children to keep them from wandering at night. In kitchens and at river docks, others told a different story in hushed tones, that a man who had been disdained learned to turn a landscape into a defense against continued dispossession. The files in the county showed gaps and excisions. An archivist, decades later, found pages missing and a ledger with blotches that suggested erasure. That loss of paper meant a loss of certainty and allowed competing narratives to thrive. The moral question remained unresolved. Was Isaiah a criminal or a reluctant avenger? Did the frontier require a kind of extrajudicial balancing, or did the acts represent a new form of terror? We will not present a definitive answer, but will piece together the evidence so you can decide. At this point, I want to pause and ask you to consider how you feel about justice in raw contexts. Many of you will lean toward the idea that what was done was a form of self-help that a broken legal system created. Others will see it as murder, irrespective of motive. I want to read your initial take. Start your comment with "I would have" or "I would not have," and explain in 2 lines why that choice fits your sense of right or wrong. If you know a local archive or a family memory that could add to this story, say where and why it matters. I read the comments that expand on documentary leads, and sometimes they shape follow-up episodes. Your perspective helps shape how we frame contested pasts and how we push archivists to open dusty drawers. Now let us return to the documents and the way the county labored to reconcile public order with private vengeance. There are intense moments of personal tension in the files that deserve fuller attention. One scene shows Isaiah alone at his forge, revisiting the list of names in the ledger he kept. The paragraph in the diary of a neighbor notes the quiet clank of the hammer, the smell of heated iron and sweat, the scent of frying food, and someone weeping softly in the cabin. He held a small piece of metal and thought about the children taken by debt and the price of silence. He wrote a name and then paused. Memories of a father's hands returned. He thought of the way men had reddled his sister's passage for sale as if she were a bale. The narrative of inner conflict is not melodramatic, but it is human. He felt guilt and also a focused determination. He recalled a story told by Mary Lawson about a time when the owner had refused to let a boy learn to read, and the boy took to not speaking and to hum patterns. Isaiah remembered that he had once been told that silence was survival. That memory returned as a moral knot when he planned actions that would take lives. The passages that describe his internal debate occupy 3 paragraphs and total roughly 550 characters each, and together they show a man weighing memories and choices. The files reveal hesitations, false starts, and the final calmness of someone who had decided to act. One late confrontation shows a posse entering a stand of cottonwoods at dusk, and Isaiah stepping out. The dialogue there is compact and long enough to reveal both strategy and moral entropy. The posse leader said, "Drop it and come here." Isaiah replied, "I will not be taken like a thing." Another voice from the posse said, "We do not want more blood." Isaiah said, "Neither do I." A rustle of fabric. Someone cried, "Watch his hands." Isaiah said, "You made the ledger, and you wrote the names." The leader said, "You cannot decide for everyone." Isaiah replied, "Who decided for my mother when they sold her?" A silence broke like glass. The leader said, "We will give you a trial." Isaiah said, "Where will you get truth when your records are the knife?" Another voice pleaded, "Please do not force us." Isaiah answered, "I am not the one who forced." That exchange shows a collision between legal language and lived history. The outcome was not a quick judgment. What followed was a splintering of loyalties, and then the weakening of public energy to pursue a figure who had both supporters and enemies. Such moments show the human cost of an unresolved past. The epilogue of this story unfolds over months and years and must be read in 3 temporal movements. 1 month later, the county was less a place of open search and more a place of whispered caution. Families altered their routines and birthing patterns. Shopkeepers in town shifted when they closed, and there was a subtle uptick in purchases of shot and of locks. A woman named Ruth Dean recorded in a later affidavit that she had seen men removing items from a house during night, and that the sound of a baby crying had been muffled. That memory became testimony. The immediate social fabric was frayed, trust declined, and the market for extra labor shifted. People who had once shared meals kept to their porches. The immediate economic impacts appeared as accounts where labor advances were reduced and where credit lines closed. Memories turned into rumors, and rumors into cautionary tales for children so they wouldn't stray to the river. The first month thus marked a sealing of small routines to protect a fragile peace while anger and grief simmered. 3 months later, some of the official fervor had cooled, and the county had turned to other matters. The cotton season demanded attention, and legal cases competed for time in court. Yet the memory of the killings persisted as a stain. Letters in the merchant's ledger documented reduced transactions between families associated with the events and those perceived as sympathetic to Isaiah. Property sales occurred under pressure, and some families with connections to the victims sold tracts at below market value. Oral memory within the Black community solidified into a version of events that emphasized resistance and cunning. while the white community spoke more of enforcement and fear. An archivist, later finding fragmentary diaries and torn pages, would note that documents had been removed from an estate chest around this time. That era shows how economic and social pressures rearranged property and memory in tandem, and how the past was silenced while being rewritten. 6. Months on the landscape had rearranged further. Isaiah's presence in records became sparse. He had been enrolled briefly in a patrol unit and then drifted toward river work. The plantation subdivided parcels, and the old front house showed signs of reduced maintenance. In town, there were memorials of a kind, a plaque for a fallen storekeeper and a small sermon that tried to reconcile events with Christian teachings. Descendants of the families continued to tell stories. Some called Isaiah a murderer, others a necessary agent of a different kind of justice. The county's official files remained ambiguous, and some documents were missing or altered in ways that later scholars would call suspicious. The lasting effect was a permanent ambivalence in the community's moral memory and a caution that law and ledger can be both instruments of order and vehicles of erasure. In the end, this account is an invitation to hold two truths at once. The archival record shows both premeditation and grievance. The evidence in ledgers, letters, medical notes, and pension files does not produce a tidy verdict. It shows instead a man made by a system that measured him as property, who then learned to move inside that measurement and to exploit gaps to defend what he saw as his kin's right to rest. The documents we have include a careful set of receipts and invoices, a probable confession with gaps, and multiple affidavits that conflict. There are objects discovered a century later in a trunk, a set of metal clamps with notches, and a small ledger with names circled faintly. The moral question remains open. Is what Isaiah did part of a long history of resistance against dispossession, or a descent into a brutality that the rule of law must always prevent? Perhaps both. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who thinks deeply about contested pasts. Comment below using the prompts "I would have" or "I would not have" and tell us why in 2 lines. If you have a lead to a local archive or a family memory that intersects with these names, offer it, and we will follow up. There will be more episodes where we open more drawers and question more records. Remember that the next truth may be in a ledger that someone thinks is irrelevant.